Hi, I'm Walt Wheeler, Executive Director of the Michigan Masonic Charitable Foundation, and we're here today recording another in our Legacy series, interviews with past Grand Masters of the Grand Lodge of Michigan. With us here today is Most Worshipful Brother W. Don Baugher, Most Worshipful Grand Master in the year 1993-1994. Don, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Walt, for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, we're going to start at the very beginning. Tell us where you were born.
Wow, that is way back. I was born down in Boot Hill, Missouri, in a little area between two very small towns on a cotton farm.
Where in Missouri was it?
Well, if you look at a map of Missouri, there's a part that looks like it should be in Arkansas. And it wasn't, because there was some farmer that had a lot of pull, and the taxes were better in Missouri than they were in Arkansas, so he had that made a part of Missouri, and it's called the Boot Hill.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about your parents.
Well, my mom her name is Anna. Her maiden name was Dale. And she lived in a little town not very far from the Boot Hill, Rector, Arkansas. And they moved over into the area close to where my father was, I think, farming also. My dad's name was William Riley Baugher, always went by Riley. And I'm not sure exactly how they met, probably in a cotton patch, but they met. My mother was 16 when they got married, and my dad was 24, so there was 8 years difference in their age. I'm not sure that if I would have been the parent, I would have allowed that, but it worked out pretty good because they were married for 60-something years before my father passed away.
Very good. I know you had several siblings. Tell us a little bit about your brothers and sisters.
Well, there were 8 of us in all, and I was number 7. And so I came along pretty late in my mother's life. Mom was born in 1900, and I was born in 1938. So she was 38 years old, and I had a sister, Rita, that was born actually 2 years after that. There were 2 of my sisters actually had married and moved away from home before I was born. And quite a coincidence that my mother and those 2 sisters were all 3 pregnant at the same time, 2 different times. And I don't think you'll hear that very often, but I had a nephew who graduated a year before me in high school, and I had a niece that actually graduated in my high school class.
That probably doesn't happen very often.
No, I don't think so.
So tell us about some childhood memories.
Well, I think it was just really fantastic to grow up in a small community like that. I've said many times that we probably knew everyone that lived in a 6 or 7 mile radius of us. It has its deficit side too, because you couldn't do anything without your parents finding out about it. But it was really neat to have that kind of a family surrounding you, a small school, just knowing everyone was, I think, a big advantage.
How big of a community was it?
Well, the little town where I went to school actually had about 2,000 people. The county seat, which was also about the same distance from our farm, probably was 10 or 12,000 people, neither of which were very large. But I mean, you go to town in either of those 2 towns, you knew almost everybody on the streets on Saturday afternoon, which is typically when people went to town there, because that's the only day they weren't in the field.
So where did you go to school?
Well, started out in a little one-room school. The name of it was Tatum Chapel. I have no idea where it got that name, but that was the name. And when I started there, it was a one-room school, and you took your lunch because there was no facilities for feeding anyone at school. And then somewhere around the 3rd or 4th grade, I'm not sure where, they put a wall down the middle of this big building and created 2 rooms So, and they added a cafeteria, and ironically, we didn't have any money to hire someone to run that, so the mothers took turnabout coming and cooking food for the kids each day. But we had 4 grades, first, second, third, and fourth, had no kindergarten, in one room, and with Mrs. Cox as our teacher. And then in the other room, you had the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and Mrs. Dean, who still is my favorite teacher of all time, was the teacher for those grades. And it's funny because by the time you got to the 8th grade, you had heard, from the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, you had heard those lessons over and over and over and over. So homework wasn't a real problem because you pretty much knew everything by the time you got to that grade.
So having 4 grades in one, did you each have individual lesson plans, or did everybody kind of learn the same thing? How did they?
They had individual lesson plans. In fact, I can still visualize this because we had rows. There were 4 rows, so you had the 5th and the 6th and the 7th and 8th, each in a row, and the teacher would just move from one to the other when she was teaching that particular class. And there were some things that was taught together, but in most cases, you kind of did your homework or did your studying or did whatever while the teacher was teaching the other class. It's quite unique.
So you didn't really have a middle school then?
Had no middle school. We were a part of a consolidated school district, and when I went to 9th grade then, we went to, or all the kids went from that little school to Senath High School, and that's where we did the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades. We, being about 7 miles out of town, rode a bus to school. We were about a half a mile from the bus stop, so we got to walk every morning and every afternoon up to the bus stop to catch the bus to ride to school. And but it was the high school, and being a consolidated school, did have the elementary school and the middle school and the high school all in one big building, and which later burned, so I can't even go back now and visit my old high school.
Did you participate in any high school activities, sports, band, anything?
Well, I tried sports. I played baseball when I was in grade school, and because you didn't have a lot of competition, I thought I was really good. And then I got in high school and realized I wasn't nearly as good as I thought I was. But I tried and played baseball the first couple of years. I ran track. I was a little better at that than I was at baseball, but my real joy was in music. And we started a high school band the end of my sophomore year. And there was no band in school prior to that. And a fellow by the name of Mr. Goodwin, Bill Goodwin, came in, and he could play every instrument in the band. And was very good at teaching us how to play the instruments. I ended up playing cornet, and I was first chair, and was able to enjoy that for the rest of my school year. The first parade that we ever marched in, we actually won first place in the parade, and that was the first year after we became a band. I also was involved with the choir. We call it the mixed chorus because it was male and female, and was honored to be selected as the representative from our school to the all-state choir.
Wow. That's
back when I could sing. The other thing that stands out, I guess, we were invited to play at a major football game, and I don't even remember for sure what it was, in Memphis, Tennessee, the high school band. And we got there, and not knowing this, they were honoring some individual who had passed away, and came to our band director and said, we want a trumpet player, a cornet player, to play taps while this honor is happening. And so they lined up one team this way and another team this way, and I was kind of the point person right in the middle of this, and I had to march out there in front of this huge stadium. And I was probably 16 years old, and play taps. I was a pretty nervous kid when I did that.
I'll bet you were. Had you played it before?
Oh yeah, I'd played it before. It worked well for me later. You'll hear a little more about that today, probably.
Okay. Good. So after high school, did you go right to college?
Actually, graduated from high school, and the next week I was in Michigan. My dad had lost his eyesight, and my last couple of years in high school, I was farming the farm, working in a grocery store to get some cash, and going to school, and needless to say, that wasn't real easy. And I told my dad that I would keep a roof over our house, our head, and food on the table, but I wasn't going to do it there on the cotton farm. And so we sold the farm, and we moved to Michigan. And I was only 17, and my first job was working at a used car lot, cleaning cars and getting them ready for people to sell, because I wasn't old enough to get a job in a factory. And I didn't know until much later. We had an uncle that owned a business in Kennett, the little town close to us, and he told my dad it was just a terrible thought for us to even consider going to Michigan. And Dad never said anything to me about it, but he really was talking it down. And my mom told me later, said, I told your Uncle Tom, if God means for us to go up there, Don will find a job in a hurry. And it took me about one day. And Mom said, I knew everything was okay. So
why Michigan?
I had a brother and sister that had moved up here. In fact, I had two brothers, and one was working at Clark Equipment. One was working at Whirlpool, and my sister was head cashier at Kroger. And during high school, I had worked as a butcher in a grocery store, and I thought, well, I can go up there and get a job as a butcher. And when I got there, I found out from the manager that they wouldn't hire siblings. So I didn't get a job as a butcher and started washing cars. And then I managed to get a job in a plastic manufacturing facility when I was 18. That lasted about 3 months and got laid off. And then I finally ended up going to Whirlpool.
So your college career then started after your work career?
Actually, I started at Whirlpool, and that was quite an experience getting in there. I was off work from Modern Plastics for about 8 weeks, and I hated it. I had never been out of work in my life. And in fact, Mom said I started picking cotton when I was 6 years old because I wouldn't stay at the house with my grandmother. And she told me that if you go to the field, you got to work. And so I did. So from 6 years old until then, I had not been out of work, and it just really bugged me not to have a job. And my brother was at Whirlpool, and they had been very good to him. He had started running a punch press, and I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but they came around giving aptitude tests to people in the factory to see if they might qualify for management positions, and he did. And they ended up sending him to college, and he became manager of our industrial engineering function. So I thought, man, if that's the kind of company they are, I really would like to work for them. I went to the ad center and applied for a job, or I wanted to, and the lady told me, we're not taking applications because we don't have any openings. And I said, well, I'll be back. And that was on Monday. And on Tuesday, I went back. And the lady's name was June Dahlstrom, who ended up being a director later. But June kind of laughed at me. She said, I told you yesterday we don't have any job openings and we're not taking applications, so why are you back? I said, I didn't know but what somebody might have quit, and you needed some help. So she said, I'm sorry, and she kind of jokingly, and I said, well, I'll see you again. I went back 4 days in a row. The fourth day, she laughed at me that time more than before, I guess, and she said, I'm going to call our HR manager and tell him he's got to meet you. And the guy's name was Bruce Tennyson. I got to know him quite well later on. And Bruce ended up talking to me, and he said, June tells me you've been here 4 days in a row, and she's told you we don't have any jobs. She won't take your application, and why do you keep coming back? I said, first of all, I really want to work for Whirlpool. And secondly, somebody's got to quit or get fired or something one of these days, and I want that job. And they still didn't take my application, but they had my name and phone number. And the next morning I got a phone call. A guy that was working in a literature warehouse, just shipping product literature to people that might move into a house and didn't have it, and we'd ship it to them. The guy quit. They didn't even interview anybody else. And I got the job just simply because I happened to be the guy that acted like I wanted it, I guess.
That's awesome.
And June Dahlstrom later on would tell people about that story because she never forgot it either.
So before we move into your progress at Whirlpool, I know you also spent some time in the Army. Just tell us how that happened.
That was quite accidental. I started in this literature warehouse and we had a boss who happened to be a Mason, I found out later, by the name of Ed Smith. And Ed kind of took a liking to me, and he said, I would like to see if you can learn to be a draftsman. He had not only that department I was in, but several others. And so he moved me over to an office that all of our drafting and art stuff was in. And he said, you're going to have to go to school, you got to learn to read blueprints, you got to do some stuff, but we'll pay for it. And so I started going to Lake Michigan College and taking blueprint reading and different courses that he thought I needed, and started progressing, there a little bit. But somewhere in the middle of that, they decided they were going to move it was a part of the service division, they were going to move that to our service division headquarters, which is in LaPorte, Indiana. And I was going to have to transfer to LaPorte. And I really didn't want to transfer to LaPorte. And I met a fellow, another guy Don Johnson, who later was past master of my lives. But Don and I were working in that department together. He was an artist and I was a draftsman. And we decided we were old enough we should move away from home, and we rented an apartment together. And we're chatting one night, probably over a beer, and he said, boy, I really don't want to go to LaPorte. What can we do? And we came up with this brilliant idea that we would go down and volunteer for the draft. Now, needless to say, my mother wasn't very happy with me when she found out I'd done that. But we went down that week and volunteered for the draft. And that's when I found out what my real name was, too, by the way. I always thought my name was Winford, W-I-N-F-O-R-D, and I filled out all the papers for the draft that way, and the lady looked at it, she said, that's not your name. So I know who I am. She said, well, that's not what your birth certificate says. And I had been born at home, and the doctor wrote the name down wrong, and when he went back, he filled my birth certificate out wrong. So I'm Winifred instead of Winford, and been living with that. Anyhow, we volunteered for the draft. And the next week, we got called. We're going in the Army, and the gal at the draft board said, that's pretty nice. You guys come up and volunteer for the draft together. You only get 2 years, and you get to spend your time together, and blah, blah, blah. And so we were kind of looking forward to that. And we jumped on a bus at a YMCA in Benton Harbor. They took us to Detroit for a processing center, and we spent a night in a hotel, and then they took us out to this base, and I forget what it was now, for processing. And that evening, I'm on a bus waving bye to Don Johnson. He's still standing outside, and I'm headed for Fort Knox, Kentucky. And I thought, well, that didn't last long, this buddy system. But I got to Fort Knox and went through processing, had my uniforms, and walked into the EM club one night, and here's Don. I thought, well, that's pretty nice. We're not going to be in the same unit because I'm 3 or 4 days ahead of him in processing, but at least we'll be on the same base so we can see each other once in a while. That night, I'm on a plane for Fort Hood, Texas, and Don stayed there. And we saw each other at Christmas that year because we both got out of basic training for Christmas. That's the last time I saw him until I came home 2 years later. So the buddy system didn't work. The Army was good for me. It taught me some discipline, I think. I was never a wild kid, but it does teach you discipline. And it let me go to Germany. I don't know that I would ever have had that opportunity had it not been for the Army. Teach you to respect your elders and sometimes do things without question. And I think for most of that's hard to do. But I ended up as a small arms repairman. That was my MOS, they call it. And I enjoyed that. But I didn't get along with the sergeant that I was reporting to, and he decided he would punish me and stick me in a 4-deuce mortar outfit, and I'd have to spend my time out in the field. So I ended up being a gunner in a 4-deuce mortar outfit, and I didn't like all the noise and that, so I volunteered to become a forward observer. And then I started reading about their life expectancy in the service, and I thought, I think I'd like to live a little longer than that. So I managed to work myself back into being a gunner in a 4-deuce mortar outfit. Germany was a great place. There still was remnants of the war there when I was there, and you met people that had been in the war, obviously, because I went over there in 1959, and nobody would ever admit that they were in the war and fighting, but you knew that a lot of them had to be.
So you got out of the military, you came back to Michigan.
I did.
Went back to Whirlpool.
And they knew that I didn't want to go to LaPorte because that's why I went in the Army. That's a heck of a decision, I guess. But when I came back, they're obligated to give you a job. And they had started a printing operation. And I interviewed with the guy that was running it and ended up getting a job running a little monolith printing press. And that was kind of the start of my upward mobility, I guess. I proved that I was pretty good at that, and got promoted to be the night. They put me on a night shift, and I was in charge of the night shift as still not a management employee, but in charge of it. And in 1964, I guess it was, I ended up interviewing for a job in LaPorte, Indiana, which I didn't want to do earlier, but this was a promotion, and so I interviewed for that. That was quite interesting. I went down for the interview, and the guy was a fellow named Foster Smythe that I interviewed with. We went through this whole process of the interview, and at the end I said, I just want you to know that I'm the guy you need for this job. And his reply was, you're the third person to tell me that. I thought he was talking about 3 other guys said, I'm the guy for the job. What he was telling me is that 3 other people had told him that I was the guy he needed for the job. So I was pretty excited about that. And I did get the job.
Excellent. So someplace in this time range, you had to meet your wife, Jo. How did that happen?
Well, that happened early on, actually. We hadn't been in Michigan very long. I met a young man named Vernon McCain, who was actually Joe's cousin. And because I didn't have any girlfriends up here and fresh, up here, he was telling me, I've got a cousin that you need to meet. But I hadn't met her. And she was, I think Joe was 15 years old at the time, and still in high school. And he told me where she lived and where she walked from her house to school and all that stuff. Well, it happened to be in a route where my sister lived, and so I went over to my sister's house one afternoon about the time I knew she was going to be coming home, and managed to stop her. She'll tell you that I picked her up on the street if you ask her how we met, but that's how I met her. Stopped her and chatted with her and told her that I knew Vernon and her cousin, and eventually met her mom, who at that time was a widow, because Joe's dad died when I think he was 36 years old. Wow. And she was quite young. But met her, and she never trusted us to go out on a date or anything for a long time. Always sent the older sister with us, but we had a good time. And the mother-in-law eventually learned to love me. How about that? But,
so when did you guys get married?
1963. So we must have met in 56. Yeah, end of 56, and we got married in 63. And last Monday night, she and I celebrated our 52nd anniversary here at Leo's in Grand Rapids, in fact.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
So I know you guys have 2 daughters. Tell us about your daughters.
Have 2. We've been married almost 10 years before Natalie was born. And she came along as quite a surprise, because we were told that we probably never would be able to have children. And so 1969, and this happened at about the same time I got promoted back up to the corporate headquarters with Whirlpool, and we moved back up. So she was born in Michigan, not in Indiana. And then we were married almost another 10 years before Melanie came along. And that was even a bigger surprise, because we certainly weren't expecting to have a second child. But they've been a blessing, and I'm glad we had them.
So tell us a little bit about the girls. What do they do?
Natalie married and has 2 daughters, Rebecca and Emily. And as you know, Natalie was very involved with Rainbow. And in 1987-88 served as the Grand Worthy Advisor for Rainbow. We had a very active assembly in Coloma, and I served on the advisory board. And in fact, me and Natalie and Joe, all 3 got our Grand Cross of Color together a lot of years ago in Rainbow. And the story she would like to tell about Rainbow, I think, is that the year that I was running for the Grand Lodge line, one of the open chairs, is the year that she was Grand Worthy Advisor and got to address the Grand Lodge. And there were 5 of us running for that open chair that year. Or there were 2 open chairs, but there were 5 of us running. And at the end of her remarks, which happens first day, as you know, before the election, all that stuff, she finished by saying, I think most of you know that my father is a candidate for the open chair in the Grand Lodge line. And she said, and my Grand Assembly will be next month. And I can't think of anything that would make me happier than to have him sitting in my Grand Assembly as a Grand Lodge officer. Well, it takes a majority vote to win. I ended up winning on the first ballot, and she later said, I did it for you, Dad. So, and she probably did. So, but I think it took 3 more ballots to elect the next open chair before they did that. Melanie joined Rainbow and said, Dad, I don't like that, because I'm never going to be Melanie. I'm always going to be Natalie's sister, or Don's daughter, because by that time I was a state official. And she just didn't enjoy it. So they started a new Job's Daughters Bethel down in Niles, and so she joined Job's Daughters. Melanie is not a dress person, and she didn't like having to put on all this garb and go down and do this stuff. She liked what it stood for, but she didn't like that. So she decided that she would rather do something else. She was always very enthusiastic about 4-H, loves animals, and loves kids. And there was a club in our area that taught, the kids in the club taught handicapped children how to ride horses. and that was her love. And so she said, I really don't want to be a rainbow girl. I really don't want to be angelic, but I'd love to do this. So that's what she did as a child, and she loved it, and it was very worthwhile.
You mentioned a couple of grandchildren. Tell us a little bit about your grandchildren.
Natalie's children, Rebecca and Emily. Rebecca, both of the girls are past worthy advisors of our Rainbow Assembly in Coloma. And Rebecca ended up graduating from high school in Lakeshore and went to beauty college. She was going to be a cosmetician, beautician. And after she finished school, decided she didn't like it very much, so she never did do that. I mean, she still does that occasionally for some of the family members, but that's not what she likes to do. So she ended up getting a job at what used to be the Whirlpool Credit Union, which is now the United Federal Credit Union, and works at the credit union. Emily wants to be a photographer, and she graduated from Lakeshore High School also, and went to the Illinois Institute of Art in Schaumburg, Illinois, and just graduated last June. And just last Thursday was interviewed and got the job with a photo studio down in Granger, Indiana. So she's headed out, I think the 14th of this month, to North Carolina for training for that company. The company's all over the country, so I'm not sure where she'll end up at, but right now she's headed for North Carolina to be trained. She's as I said, she was also a worthy advisor. Her big thing, the year that she was worthy advisor, her charity, her other grandfather ended up having to have a kidney transplant. And so in her term, she raised money for the organization that gets people to volunteer to donate their body parts for that. I forget what it's called, but she was very, very active in that, and we're pretty proud of both of them.
That's excellent. So let's move back to your Whirlpool career.
I better, if I want to be able to go home and talk to Melanie, I better talk about her child a little bit too before we do that. Melanie has one child, Hannah, and I think you know she's a type 1 diabetic, and she's 14 now. And Hannah was diagnosed as a diabetic when she was 9. Quite coincidentally, we were babysitting for her one day, and because Joe is diabetic, she tests her sugar all the time, and Melanie called and said, "Mom, would you mind testing her sugar, because I just suspect there's an issue." And Melanie had been an avid, well, still is an avid reader, and she read all the babysitter books. And one of the kids in that series of books had type 1 diabetes, and it talked about the symptoms, and she remembered that and thought Hannah was showing some of those same symptoms, and that's why she ended up having her tested. So Hannah was tested, but she's doing great. We just now got her a new pump, and you don't have to do all the things you used to with giving shots, and it's quite an adjustment, not only for her but for the family, and it's not cheap, so it's an expense for Melanie as well. But Hannah's doing good and living with her diabetes, and we had a deal when she was in elementary school. A lot of kids asking questions, and kids can be pretty cruel. Why do you have to go to the nurse every day before you have your lunch, and why do you have to take shots and all this stuff? And so they did a video. There were 2 other kids in that school that had diabetes. They did a video and interviewed each of the kids, and then they had the nurse of the school and the social worker together stop every class for a period of like 30 minutes and bring them in and show them the video about what diabetes is and let them ask the kids questions. And one of the questions one of the kids asked Hannah was, "What did you think when you first heard you had diabetes?" And Hannah's response was, because of the name of it, diabetes, I thought I was going to die. Yeah. Fortunately, she didn't. Yeah.
Actually, we just met Hannah not too long ago in
That's
Washington,
right.
D.C. Okay, so now let's go back to Whirlpool. And you spent your entire career there.
Just about 39 years.
39 years. And so you received several promotions over the years, and you ended up in what position?
I retired as the corporate purchasing manager. And I had, as you know, I was in LaPorte and running the printing operation, and the purchasing department had decided they wanted to try to bring all the procurement together for printed materials. And I guess I must have had the most experience in the company, and so I was offered a job as a buyer for printed material. And but it wasn't just the buyer, it also included developing all of the product literature that goes into the product, the use and care information, and use, anything that you have in that plastic packet when you open a refrigerator or a washer or dryer. I had a group that developed that, and then we made sure that it got to all the divisions. And that was why I was brought back to the corporate headquarters. And that expanded. We ended up doing the warehousing for that. So actually the warehouse that I started at Whirlpool in, I ended up managing later on. In fact, I had some of the same people that I had worked for working for me later on. That's a little uneasy at first, but it worked. And I stayed in that job from, let's see, I came up in 69. Probably 75, 76 in that time frame. And I had a boss that decided he would retire early, and which moved my career by about 10 years forward, I guess, because I got his job. And I took his job quite young, and I got bored real easy. And so I would tell my boss, you got to give me something else to do. So I ended up having office services given to me as a part of my job, and that wasn't quite enough. So they ended up giving me the mail room and all of that for the corporate area. And I still wasn't satisfied, so I ended up with the corporate food services for all of our divisions. And then we had a guy retire, and they decided not to replace him, and they were trying to separate some of the things he was doing. And I ended up with the forms and records management function for globally. So that was quite a job. And so I had all kinds of stuff I could do, and it never was boring, simply because if I got in and didn't like what I had to do or was doing, I just go to one of the other departments and do some stuff. But it was fun. It was a lot of fun.
Variety always helps.
Yeah.
So other than the Masonic fraternity, are there any other organizations or groups you've been active in or involved with?
Well, I got interested in the issue of drug abuse early on with the Masons, and we got to looking around in the Berrien County area at what we might be able to do outside of the fraternity to address that issue. And me and a lady at the time was with Andrews University, started a group trying to pull people together, the health department and different agencies that might deal with drug abuse if it was happening. And we pulled a group together and actually met at Johnson Rohoff advertising building for a long time. Don Johnson was a part of it. The health department was a part of it, and we called it SAIL, and it was an acronym for Substance Abuse Impairs Living. And so I was a co-founder with this lady and the first president or chairman of that board. And we were together probably 5 or 6 years before we thought we had accomplished our mission, and it dissolved. Other than that, when I was in LaPorte and realized that I was moving into management positions, and I'd get up in front of a group and start talking, and I was so nervous you could see my pants shaking. I thought, boy, I got to do something about that. So I joined Toastmasters and was in Toastmasters for a few years and became president of the local Toastmasters club. And then when I moved, after I retired, we sold our house in Stevensville, St. Joe area, and bought a place on Paw Paw Lake. I thought, man, I need to join something out here so I can get to meet all the people and get to know some of my neighbors. And I joined the Lions Club. I found out I knew most of the guys already anyhow, but then actually while I was with the National Masonic Foundation for Children, served as president of our Lions Club also. So those are pretty much my outside Masonic activities. Yeah.
Okay. So let's turn to the Masonic fraternity. How did you first learn of Masonry?
I married into it. My father-in-law was very, very active in Lakeshore Lodge. In fact, he was the chaplain, I think, when I married Joe. And I didn't know anything about Freemasonry. I think that my first recollection of Masonry at all was still down in Missouri, and we had a member of our church pass away, and he was a member of the Knights Templars. And we went to his funeral, and I remember the honor guard. And I thought, boy, that is really impressive. But I really didn't know anything about it. It's amazing, after I became a Mason, what I learned. You know, the guy that I worked for in the Piggly Wiggly store was a Mason. There's so many people that you knew that you found out were Masons. Two of my mother's brothers were Masons, and I didn't know that. I'm sorry, not my mother's brothers, my grandmother's brothers. And I learned that later. But my father-in-law was always doing business with Masons, and he's always talking about Freemasons, and I just was curious. And one day he and I are standing in the kitchen. He had a little machine shop, and we'd been working. We'd come walking in to get something to drink, and I said, "What's the deal with this Masonry stuff? You know, you need your furnace fixed, you call a Mason. If you need car fixed, you go to a Mason. And, you know, what do I got to do to become a part of that?" And he said, "I think you just did it." And he signed my petition, and I joined Lakeshore Lodge in 1963. That is the same year that he and my mother-in-law made a decision that because she had some real bronchial problems, that they needed to move to Arizona. So he ended up getting me through the 3 degrees, and then they moved. So I never was really able to be very active with him here. But that's what got me into the Masonic fraternity.
And of course, I knew it was 1963 that you joined because we recently had the pleasure of presenting you your 50-year pin. And
that was quite an interesting little tribute. I had no idea that was going to happen. Grandmaster Baugher told me that he was going to present that at Grand Lodge, but when he started calling off you guys, I thought, oh boy, this is not going to be good. And fortunately, it ended up being a whole lot better than I thought it was going to be. But and I said then that I don't think there's any way anyone who ever joins this fraternity could even conceive the possibility that 50 years from then they would be able to receive their 50-year pin from the Grand Master at Grand Lodge by all those friends who were past Grand Masters. It blew my mind. It really did.
It was a great event.
Yeah.
So did you get active in the lodge right away? Was there a period where you weren't so active?
I was active until 64 when I got transferred down to Indiana. And I didn't transfer my membership down there. There was a fellow by the name of Ira Smurl who was very, very active in the lodge, and Eastern Star and New York Rite, who I met, worked at LaPorte. And he would like for me to have transferred my Blue Lodge membership, but I said no. But they were having a what we call an all-degree day, I guess, in Yorkright. And I went to Hammond, Indiana with Ira as my sponsor and went through the Yorkright degrees, with the exception of the Order of the Temple. And he wanted me to come back and do that in LaPorte. So I joined that down there. And then I went to Lodge a couple, 3 times, but not very much. When I got transferred back in '69, I started going back to Lakeshore Lodge, but I found myself going to Coloma more often than Lakeshore, simply because I had a brother-in-law and 2 nephews that were all in the moving line in Coloma. So I was going out with them. Bruce Phillips, who was the master at the time, and he was always using me to fill in a spot that was not filled, and he said, you know, if you remember this lodge, I'd appoint you as a steward. But I can't unless you remember this lodge. And I said, well, I can fix that. So I ended up petitioning Coloma Lodge for transfer and was accepted. And it was a great move. You know, Lakeshore's a great lodge too. But I think I had a better fit at Coloma, and especially with the relatives that I had in the lodge out there. My brother-in-law was master the year before I was, and ended up moving over a chair and being my chaplain, and Bill Williams, and it was just neat to be there with those guys.
When were you master the first time?
1978.
1978.
Yep, same year that Melanie was born. So that's my trophy. Yeah.
Is there anything that happened that year as Worshipful Master that sticks in your mind?
Oh, there's several things. We had a really active lodge. And we always traded visits with a lodge in Chicago. It started out being Lawndale Lodge. They moved further west. But we always had a big day with them. We go over there once a year. They come to ours once a year. And we would do Michigan Ritual in Illinois with the dispensation. And they did the same thing over here with the dispensation. That was always fun. I guess there's 2 things that stick out in my mind about that year. The first was my installation, and I think you know Fred Krigo installed me, and at the end of this thing you get the opportunity to introduce your family. Well, my father and mother-in-law had moved to Arizona by that time, and I introduced everybody in the room just about but my mother-in-law, and it took me a long time to live that one down. The other thing that sticks out is I had been to Grand Lodge, and came back from Grand Lodge, and I had a membership award to present, and I brought a camera, and I gave it to my marshal, and I said, when I go to the altar to make this presentation, I want you to walk out here and take some pictures, because I want to have this for later. And I guess this past master on the side hadn't seen me giving him the camera and didn't know what I had told him to do. And when I walked out to give this presentation, and the marshal comes out with his camera, this past master stood up and said, "Worshipful Master, you can't do that. The Bible's open. You can't take pictures in the lodge like that." And I said, "Wow, I'm really surprised at that." I said, "I just got back from Grand Lodge, and I remember the Grand Master rapping the gavel and calling the Grand Lodge at ease. They didn't do anything with the Bible. They didn't do anything. They received Eastern Star. They did all kinds of stuff. They had all kinds of pictures being taken. But just so you're comfortable with this lodge will be at ease at the sound of the shutter." He never challenged me the rest of the year.
Sound of the shutter. I like it. You've mentioned a few of the appended and affiliated organizations. Tell us some of the ones that you're a member of and involved with.
The first one I joined was Yorkright after coming out of Blue Lodge, and I really liked what they taught, but being young and aggressive and moving up, in Whirlpool, you don't have a whole lot of time sometimes, and I realized that Yorkright took a lot of time. And so I was not willing to, get into a moving line or do anything in York Rite simply because of that. And then I ended up joining the Shrine. When I moved back to Michigan, I joined Saladin. I'm still a member there. And I enjoyed the Shrine. Ended up getting into mini bike patrol and doing some things like that. But Ted, can't even think of his last name now. I'll think of it in a minute.
Ted Daniels?
Ted Daniels, yeah, thank you. Ted Daniels called me one day and he said, "Hey, I'm going up to Scottish Rite. You want to go with me?" And I said, "I don't belong to Scottish Rite." He said, "Well, you're a Shriner." I said, "Yeah, but I belong to York Rite." He said, "Well, you got to belong to Scottish Rite." I said, "Ted, I can't afford it." He said, "Yes, you can, because I'm going to pay your fee and you can just pay me off when you have the money to do it." So I thought about it a little bit. I said, "Okay, go ahead." So we had I don't remember how much it was there, probably $100, but we had a Shrine luncheon every Friday down in St. Joe. And Ted got the petition, paid my fee, and I said, "I'll pay you when I can." I came up and got my degrees. Ended up actually being president of my class, the Abbott Norris class. But we'd meet on Fridays, and I'd go in and I'd hand Ted $2 or $1 or $3 or whatever I happened to have. And I didn't realize it, but he had a file in his office that had a lot of guys like me in it that he had signed up and paid their fee. And I walked in one day and I handed him $2, and he said that was it. So he ended up paying my fee, and I joined Scottish Rite, and that's kind of history after that. And been pretty active with Scottish Rite. I also later was invited to join Red Cross, and that's been a good experience. I think mainly for the people that are there. It's just a great group of guys, and that's kind of what Freemasonry is all about. I think you make friends that you wouldn't otherwise have made. It's a great organization, not only in Red Cross but all the others. Yeah.
I know that you served as Commander-in-Chief of the Consistory in the Scottish Rite. Any other leadership positions in the other bodies?
Well, that was a lot of fun. I think especially as you age, you get a little concerned about being able to memorize ritual anymore. And I had people telling me that this is not going to be easy for you, because I got in when I was like 64. And I knew that I was going to be 70 years old by the time I went through that 6-year line. But I was amazed at how much easier it was than I thought it was going to be. And I think maybe because I started learning ritual a whole different way. I would sit down and read it and read it and read it, make sure I understood the meaning of it before I ever tried to commit anything to memory. And by doing that, even if you forgot a word, you could still say something that meant about the same thing and go through it. But being Commander-in-Chief was a great experience. I love that flag talk, and it's just great. I ended up in Red Cross being the Puissant Sovereign, and went through that. I think it's pretty automatic. If you get elected into Red Cross, you go in at the bottom chair and work your way up. In fact, I think that's what you've just done, isn't it?
I actually will be installed as Puissant Sovereign in about a week. Yeah.
Right.
Of the appendant and affiliated bodies, which are your most favorite?
Well, I guess if I look back in earlier life, I would, because they're affiliated, I would say our youth groups, simply because I was involved with all of them. Job's and Rainbow mostly because I had daughters and no sons. But as as they grew up and I wasn't as active in the youth groups, Scottish Rite has to be where I really enjoy doing the work. I served on the board when I was Commander-in-Chief. I'm now the deputy's representative here in the Valley of Grand Rapids and work a lot with you, as you know. We got a meeting tonight when this is all over. But I really enjoy the people in Scottish Rite. And although I'm a whole lot more committed, I think, time-wise than you have to be just to go through a chair in Scottish Rite, I think that's really what attracted me to Scottish Rite, is that I could work in a degree. I've directed 2 or 3 different degrees. I could work in a degree, do the practices, and walk away feeling like I had made a contribution without having to be here every week or every month or whatever. And you still get that good feeling about doing something good.
Actually, I think it's through Scottish Rite that you and I first met. When
Well, I'm
you were
sure it is.
Master of Ceremonies, and I had another little spot. Over the years, you've received many honors and awards. Are there a few that stick out as being more special or more meaningful? Like, they all mean something, obviously.
Sure. Well, I cherish the 3 awards I got from our youth groups, because I have the Grand Cross, and I have the Grand Triangle from Jobs, and I have the Honorary Legion of Honor from D. Malay. And then when I stepped down as executive director for the National Masonic Foundation for Children, I was given their Medallion of Excellence Award. Normally that's given to Grand Lodges, not individuals. I think I'm only the 3rd individual that ever received that, and I considered that quite an honor. The other, and that plaque I have on my wall. The other thing that I was honored with, that wasn't really given as an honor but as a recognition for some service, I received from Prince Hall. And at their Grand Lodge session 3, maybe 4 years ago now, they gave me a plaque recognizing me as the Grand Master who started the discussion for recognition between our 2 Grand Lodges. And that probably not only is the greatest feeling that I ever had for an honor, but it's probably the greatest thing I ever did for Freemasonry. Maybe besides appointing Bob Conley as Grand Lecturer, that was pretty good too.
Yeah. I was there when you got that honor, and it was amazing. You mentioned the National Masonic Foundation for Children. Let's talk a little bit about that. You've been very involved with the Student Assistance Program and the National Masonic Foundation for Children. Tell us about your involvement there and how that first came about.
Well, my first thoughts with that happened at the Grand Lodge session where I was elected into the Grand Lodge line, and Don Hemming was Grand Master. And he had been to the Conference of Grand Masters the year before, and the National Masonic Foundation for Children had just been organized. And they were looking for funding, and because their goal was to identify ways that Freemasonry could help with the issue of drug abuse, mainly in our schools but all over the country. And he wanted to help. He wanted some funds appropriated to donate to the National Masonic Foundation, so that Michigan would be a part of that. And it was voted down. And I can still see the disappointment in his face when that happened. So I thought, I really need to learn a little about that. I'm going to be in the Grand Lodge line, and Ken Bolton was the Grand Master then after that session. And Ken and I started talking about it, and I started talking about it with the other moving line, and Bill Skrepnik picked up on it. And Bill was 2 chairs in front of me in the Grand Lodge line. And he said, if you can put it together, the year I'm Grand Master, we'll do a Masonic Model Student Assistance Program here in Michigan. And so I started working on it. And not only was I able to put the training together, still at Whirlpool at the time, and I went to our Whirlpool Foundation and convinced them to fund the first training that we had, which we did in Benton Harbor. And so we did the training. Bill Skrepnik, I think, came back from the Grand Lodge, Illinois, and stopped in and spent the day with us watching the training, and he fell in love with it also. In fact, we just honored him last year, or this year, with our golf outing. But Bill wanted me to continue promoting it, and which I did. And I'm in my office one day at Whirlpool, and my secretary came in with this really funny look on her face. She said, "Don, there's a federal judge from Colorado on the phone, wants to talk to you." And I'm thinking, what the heck did I do now? I got on the phone, and it was Don Smith, past Grand Master from the Grand Lodge of Colorado, who was at that time the president of the board for the National Masonic Foundation for Children. And he wanted to know if I would be interested in serving on the board. And of course I said yes. And that was the beginning of the process to make sure I wanted to do it. And then they had to get the current Grand Master to approve it, which they did. And I was elected to the board 91, 92, I'm not even sure. But I think the rest of that's kind of history. I moved through the board, served as president for 3 or 4 years, and then when Larry Chisholm decided to retire, he called me and said, "You're the only guy that I know of that has the history that can step into this job." And I said, "Oh, I am really uncomfortable with that." First of all, being president and then moving into what was a paying position, I said, "I'm just uncomfortable with that. And you're going to have to sell that to the board. I'm not going to." Well, he did, obviously, because he retired and I took over for about 4.5 years as executive director. Probably the most rewarding experience that I've ever had, because Masonic experience, because you realize that there are a lot of kids out there in need, and a lot of people just don't know how to help them. And it gave me the opportunity to work with Grand Lodges around the country, organize the student assistance training, and at that time I think we had 23 states that were active in it. You spend a lot of time in the air, but you help a lot of kids. And to have, well, my first experience with it when we decided to go with it here in Michigan was I sent 2 ladies from our, what's called RISA now, Intermediate School District, to a training in Illinois. And Linda Vingling, one of them, called me in my office the next morning, and she had been through 1 day of training and she was going into the second day. At that time it was 3 days. And she said, "Don, I just had to call you to tell you what a great organization it is you belong to." Now, I don't know of too many Masons that have ever had that happen to them. But if I needed to be sold, that did it. And, you know, we've been doing training in Michigan since 1991.
Yes, we have. So let's talk about some of the Grandmasters that you've known personally prior to your time in the Grand Lodge line.
Probably the oldest one, and I actually sat in lodge with him the last time he was ever in lodge, was Roscoe Birch. And I knew his son quite well because Roscoe owned a printing company in Benton Harbor, and we did a lot of purchasing of their products. So I knew his son, Red Birch, and he was a Mason also. And we went to a past masters night at Lakeshore Lodge, and Red brought Roscoe, who was getting quite feeble by then, to that meeting, and I actually sat at the table with him. And it's probably the first one that I, knew very well. Bob Lake was also a member of my lodge and was past master later on. And I knew Bob quite well. He worked at Whirlpool also. And I think that was kind of a groundbreaker for me, simply because Whirlpool kind of knew what to expect when I got into that line, that I wasn't going to be there a lot. Other than that, when I moved from LaPorte up to the Ed Center in purchasing, one of the guys that was calling on me as a paper salesman was Newt Bacon. And it just really blew my mind. Here I'm a relatively new Mason and find out that I've got a past Grand Master sitting across the desk from me trying to sell me paper. And Newt and I became fairly close after that, as did Bob Lake and I. But you start naming some of the guys that really influenced you. Royce Curlis could be a gruff old guy, but he was just a great guy. He took a liking to me and gave me all kinds of advice. I don't know. There's so many of the guys that impacted my life and mentored me. Some were not past Grands. Paul Florin. Paul Florin really wanted me to run for the Grand Lodge line. Fred Creo really wanted me to run from the Grand Lodge line. Both of those were past commander-in-chiefs of the consistory and past masters of my original lodge in Lakeshore. But, when you look back and you don't know who influenced you the most, but all of those guys had a big impact on my life.
When you finally made the decision to run for Grand Lodge, what was the deciding factor? What made you decide?
Well, I was master of my lodge in 78, and then I was elected in 79 to the Board of General Purposes. And I got to see how the Grand Lodge functions and get to know a lot of the guys. And I guess from my business background, I saw some things that I thought I could do better, maybe, and that I would like to be a part of that. But over that, I was on the board for 6 years, and over that period of time, it just kind of evolved. But then you have people like Newt Bacon saying, you really need to do this, or you really need to give it some thought. And my father-in-law had gotten appointed as Grand Marshal in Arizona when they moved out there, and he wanted me to get into the line. My brother-in-law out in Arizona, he was 2 when they moved out there, ended up being State Master Counselor of DeMolay. And then my daughter being as involved as she was the Rainbow here, it just seemed like it was a natural thing for me to go ahead and consider that. And I've never been sorry. But many people impacted that decision, and if you look back at it, there are a lot of things that we ended up doing that I'd say, man, I hope I don't ever have to do that again. But there are so many things that are so rewarding that I don't think you're ever really sorry.
You had mentioned previously that 5 guys ran for 2 open spots that year, and I know you got elected to the junior Grand Deacon, so you didn't have to serve as Grand Marshal.
Right.
But who was the first Grand Master that you served with then?
Ken Bolton.
Ken Bolton was first.
And that was quite different. Ken's from England, and they're much more proper there than we tend to be here. In fact, you may have heard Joe's story, because once you're elected into the line, the women kind of surround your wife and start talking to her about what she is expected to do and blah blah blah. And well, we had a 9-year-old daughter. Melanie was 9 years old when I got elected, and Ann kept saying, and Joe, you'll need to be here at a certain time, and you'll need to be wearing a certain something. And Joe saying, but Ann, you realize that we've got a 9-year-old daughter, and some of this stuff I can't be to. And Ann wasn't listening very well to that, so she kept telling her over and over and over. And finally, Joe told me, I finally said, Ann, you need to remember I didn't run for anything. So that kind of set the tone, I think. But Ken and I were great friends when he was in the Grand Lodge line moving through. If he was on my side of the state, he spent the night at our house, so we got to be good friends. But he was the first one. Yeah.
So as you progressed through the line and as you became Grand Master, was there anything that surprised you?
Well, I think the amount of time was a surprise, and I think those of us who are serving in Lodge always just think of the Grand Lodge officers as being, a group of people that just basically do everything together. And my first big surprise was, as you know, Al Darling was the Grand Tyler at the time. I think he was Grand Tyler 21 years or something like that. But he lived in Battle Creek, me living in St. Joe, and most of our board meetings were in Detroit, so when I would come across state, I'd pick him up. Well, the first board meeting that I'm supposed to go to, I stopped and picked up Al. And we're headed for Detroit, and Al said, now, Don, let me kind of tell you how this works. He said, you're invited to the board meeting, and you're encouraged to attend. But he said, you have no voice. Unless the Grand Master specifically asks you a question, you don't say anything. And that was a surprise to me because I just thought this is one big happy bunch. Well, it wasn't, obviously. And then he said, and at the end of the meeting, when the meeting is over, he's going to come around the room and he's going to ask every officer there, including you, if you have any remarks. And your answer is to be, nothing, Grandmaster. So that was a little surprise early on. I think the change, and you witnessed this, from how quickly you move from one Grandmaster to the next was a total surprise to me. I mean, there's no fading away. It's just a drop off. You are in a Grand Lodge session, you elect a new guy. The old guy sits out in the audience. Typically, they don't do it so much anymore. But the old guy would sit out in the audience, and immediately after Grand Lodge, you went into a board meeting, and instantly it was Grandmaster to the new guy, and the other guy is just gone. And I remember commenting to Bob Osborne one time that I thought that was a shame because you've worked 7 years, you've gained all this knowledge, and then all of a sudden you just disappear. And his response to me was, not unless you want to. If you want to stay active, you can. But many of them, because you really burn out in that 7 years, many of them just wanted to disappear. The postman thought I died. The next day after you stopped getting mail, the phone quits ringing, and that was a surprise. I think the other thing is that how much time it takes. You never, ever expect that, and how many miles you put on a car. It's just unreal how much time you spend in a car.
You do.
And by yourself a lot, yeah.
So let's move into your year as Grandmaster. Okay. What were some of the highlights of the year?
Well, I guess if I look at it, there are 3 or 4 that really stand out. We can talk about them individually, but the first thing I did was to change Grand Honors, and that was as it happened, not very pleasant, because I had the agreement of the Grand Lodge officers, the board of directors, jurisprudence had been consulted, and everyone knew that I was writing an edict that would actually change Grand Honors from what we used to do with all the temple building and whatever to what we currently use with 3x3. And I intended to do that so that I was the first person that ever got them that way, to demonstrate it to those in attendance what they were. And less than 30 minutes before I was to be installed, jurisprudence approached me and said, we were wrong, you don't have the authority to do this because it's a constitutional change. And I thought, oh, wow. And, I'd already written this thing, all the officers are expecting it. And I really mulled it over in my mind, and I finally said, guys, I don't think it's a constitutional change. The Constitution basically says Grand Honors, for Grand Honors, you refer to a section in another book. It's not written in the Constitution. And I said, I'm comfortable that I'm not violating the Constitution if I go ahead and do this. And they didn't agree, but I did it. So then there was an argument about, well, when can we use the new Grand Honors? And I said, when can I issue an edict? And nobody could answer that. I says, okay, let's back into this process. Does it have to be at the end of Grand Lodge? Well, don't know. Once I've taken the obligation, would you consider that I'm now the Grand Master? And they all said pretty much, yeah, that would be. I said, okay, then that's when the edict's going to be read. So I took the obligation, had my father-in-law there to escort me to the altar. And I stood up and I said, before I am taken to the east, there's an edict that I want the installing officer to read. And Ken Bolton was my installing officer, and he read the edict changing the grand honors. And I said, when I get to the east, those are the grand honors we'll use. And I still remember looking around the room, there were a lot of guys that wouldn't do that. They were very uncomfortable with doing the grand honors that way. So that was that was the first thing I did. I guess the second thing, and maybe the more drastic thing that I did, looking back on it, was starting the discussion with Prince Hall about recognition. And I had talked to the officers, everybody, all the officers, very comfortable with this. And we were holding district meetings. And so I said, I'm going to announce at the district meetings that I will be starting dialogue with Prince Hall to see if we can come up with a way to recognize them. And this is fairly new because just the year before, Connecticut had recognized Prince Hall. And so there weren't a whole lot of jurisdictions that had done it yet. And so anyhow, I said, I'm going to start the dialogue. And we were at a district meeting, I think we're in Cadillac. And I announced what I was going to do. And an old boy over on the sidelines got up with a very southern accent. And he said, Grand Master, if you recognize them, and he used a word we won't put in here, I will drop my membership in Michigan. He said, I'm a member of a Kentucky lodge. I'm not sitting in lodge with them. And it really caught me off guard. And I thought, how do you address that kind of a response in a crowd that probably 99% at least were in favor of? And Bob Conley was with me, and I'm looking at Bob, and he's looking at me, and I'm thinking, oh, what do we do now? I turned to the guy, and I said, brother, it's pretty obvious from your comment that you really don't care what the brothers in this room think of you. I said, you care what God thinks of you? And boy, the room just went quiet. And the guy sat down. And he came up after the meeting was over and apologized for doing it the way he'd done it. But he ended up coming up to me and he said, I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to sit in lodge with a person of color. And I said, you need to try it. You need to try it once and see if it feels any different, because he's there for the same moral teachings you are. He took an obligation as the elder just like you did. Try it. And he turned and walked away from me, and before he left that night, he came back and he said, I'll try it. And I don't know if he ever did or not, because I never saw him after that I know of, but that's kind of the way it got started. I ended up calling Leon Austin, who at that time was the Prince Hall Grand Master, and he answered the phone. And I said, is this Brother Austin, the Grand Master of Prince Hall Grand Lodge? And he said, yeah. Who's this? And I said, well, this is Don Baugher, and I'm the Grand Master of the other Grand Lodge here in Michigan. He said, I've heard of you. And so we started talking. And I said, I don't know where we go with this or how fast we can do anything, but I would like for us to get together and just talk about what we can do for recognition between our organizations. And Leon said to me, and he called me Grandmaster and I called him Grandmaster, and he said, Grandmaster, he said, if you want to get together and talk about recognition with us maintaining our identity, I'm agreeable to that. If you want to get together and talk about us merging with you, there's no conversation. And I said, we don't want a merger. We want you guys to keep your identity. We want to keep our identity, but we want to recognize you if we can. And he said, well, let's start talking. And we did. And so and I don't remember what month this was, but he said, our Grand Lodge session's in April, and I'd like for you to come to our Grand Lodge session. And I said, I can't do that. And he said, why? I said, because if we do that, it's going to ruin everything we're trying to work on for recognition, because that would be illegal, because I would be talking with a clandestine Mason. They don't like that word, and they call it non-Prince Hall Masons, not clandestine. But he said, well, we got to figure out some way for you to be there. So I said, at our Grand Lodge session, we call the Grand Lodge at ease, and we bring in the youth groups, and we bring in Eastern Star, whatever. And if you do that, and you bring me in when the Grand Lodge is at ease, I'll come. And he said, that'll work. So he did, and then I was received on the floor with Don Reno. And then that night, they invited me to be their speaker at the banquet. So I was able to speak. And then we reciprocated and invited them to come to our Grand Lodge. And by that time, Ozzie Gardner was the new Grand Master. Leon went out that year. And so they both came. And I'm not sure who else they had with them, probably the Grand Secretary too. But anyhow, they came. And we're waiting for the Grand Lodge session to open. And Doug Hagee, who at that time probably was my senior Grand Deacon, came in and he said, Grand Master, there's some rumbling going on inside that if you bring in Prince Hall, a group of people are going to walk out. And I said, oh my God, I certainly hadn't expected that. And so I said, well, I got to give that some thought, because I don't want to embarrass anybody. So I went to Ozzie. And I said, Grandmaster, here's the deal. I've been told that if I bring you in, even when the Grand Lodge is at ease, I'm going to have some guys walking out. And there was a lot of discussion, and then he made some comment about, yeah, we got some rednecks in our organization too, that kind of a thing. He said, Grandmaster, what would you like for me to do? And I said, 25 years from now, no one will remember those guys that walked out, but they're going to remember the first time you walked in. And he said, I'm going in. And he did. And we received him. He's a little short guy, about Don Reno's size. And he stands up. I gave him an opportunity to bring some greetings. And he stood at that podium, it seemed like forever, holding on to both sides of this thing, and looked out over that audience all back and forth. And he finally said, I have long sought this opportunity. And the crowd just kind of went wild at that. And he told a little story that I can share with you if you want to hear it, that kind of put a lot of meaning to what was going on right then. He was talking about two neighbors that both had dogs. And one was a little bitty dog, one was a great big dog. And he said the guy with the big dog would walk his dog every morning, and it would come right by the house of the guy with the little dog. And the little dog knew that there was a fence around the house, and big dog couldn't get to him, so he'd come charging off of the porch and run up against this gate out front and bark into this big dog. Did it every day. One day he's walking by, the big dog was, and the little dog comes charging off the porch, and when he hit the fence or the gate, it swung open. And he said, the little dog is standing here looking up at the big dog thinking, who left the gate open? And he said, I'm sure today, when you saw us walking in here, you're wondering who left the gate open. And he said, turned to me, and he said, Grandmaster Baugher left the gate open. And that was the start of, it took us a while, actually, because you got to have a treaty, and you got to have some agreements to do that. And unfortunately, later on, when I became Grand Secretary, after we had recognized Prince Hall, we got the opportunity then to work with Bob Morrow from the United Grand Lodge of England, and they got recognition from the United Grand Lodge of England too, and I got to be a part of that. It was pretty neat.
It is awesome. And so, and you actually just referred to it. After you went out as Grand Master, you took on another job in the Grand Lodge, that of Grand Secretary. Tell us a little bit about that and how that position differs from the moving line. You have a lot of different responsibilities and duties.
Yeah, you do. Of course, when I got that job under some not great circumstances, but excuse me. I moved into it, and at that time we still had a business manager. So Dick Ammon was still very involved in the operation of the day-to-day Grand Lodge. And I was really only in the Grand Lodge maybe 3 or 4 times a month. I tried to get up here once a week, signing documents that needed to be done or just working with the staff or whatever. Yeah, it's a lot different than being in that moving line. There's a lot more responsibility. I was very uncomfortable with a lot of it because I had all the responsibility, but I wasn't there every day making all the decisions that were going on in that Grand Lodge office. And you still had to attend the board meetings, and you were a member of the board of directors. So there's a lot of responsibility to it. I enjoyed the visitations with other Grand Lodges and the camaraderie that we had with other Grand Secretaries. Grand Secretaries are kind of a little fraternity within a fraternity. They really are, because that's, generally speaking, is the continuity of Grand Lodge. That's the guy that's going to be there for several years. The others kind of come and go, and you may have a flash and they're out of there, but the Grand Secretaries are typically there for a while. And you build relationships. One that was kind of strange was with Tom Jackson from Pennsylvania. He's just one of my favorite people because of his knowledge of Freemasonry. And for some reason, he and I kind of hit it off. Maybe because of the way I pronounce my last name and he doesn't. But there's a lot of work that is very enjoyable. Maybe one of the toughest times when I was Grand Secretary was when we suspended recognition with the Grand Lodge of Minnesota over an issue with them recognizing 2 Grand Lodges in one jurisdiction without those 2 Grand Lodges recognizing each other. And I still get some negative comments about that, but I still think it was the right thing to do. And it caused the healing process to start, I think, a lot sooner than it would otherwise, because we had always, and still are, we had been very close with Minnesota. And I think we probably have more honorary past Grand Masters from Minnesota than any other jurisdiction. And for us to suspend recognition was pretty drastic. And Paul Cross did the right thing by doing that, I think.
So, what do you think the fraternity needs to do to grow and prosper?
Bob Conley asked me one time when he was really involved with Renewal, he still is, but that was a group that were really working on things, and he said basically the same question, what do we need to do? And I said, I think we need to be the fraternity that all of us believe we used to be. But none of us really know if that was true or not. If we were what I think we were then, back in the time when this country was being formed, or years after that, if we were now what I think we were then, we wouldn't have a membership problem. I'm not sure we even have a membership problem today, although our memberships are way down. I think we have a participation problem. And what we need to do is be mentoring our new Masons so that they participate instead of, like so many of them, come in, join, and in 5 years you never see them again. I believe that the mentoring program that Bob Conley is teaching right now is the best tool that we have for keeping people active. My lodge is going to adopt that. We've gone, when I was Grand Master, we had 76,000 Masons. Right now we're less than 35,000. I'm not sure what the number is, but we're less than 35. At some point in time, we've got too few to do the job that we need to do as Masons. And we at one point in time had almost 600 lodges, and now we're down to about 300, a little under, I guess. I don't know that that's a bad thing. We needed those lodges years ago because people couldn't travel like we do today. But I believe if we get the participation, like Watervliet and Coloma merged, we were 2 miles apart. It really was kind of senseless for us both to have lodges. So I think consolidating and putting the group together will help build better lodges within a community, and the mentoring will keep our youngsters active and involved.
What would you tell somebody that came to you and said, I'm thinking about joining Freemasonry? What advice would you give them?
Well, I just had that opportunity last week because we had a young man submit or ask some questions about the fraternity online. And Rob sent the information to me, and I contacted the young man, found out that I know his grandparents, and arranged a meeting for the two of us, and we had one other lodge member come in, and I said, I don't think I need to tell you this because most young men who are today looking at joining have already done all the research you can imagine. And they probably know more about Freemasonry than most of our members who are in their 60s and 70s, simply because all that information is out there. So I told this young man, do the research. I gave him some literature to read, but I said the main thing you need to understand is that this is not a process we need to rush you through. I don't care if it takes you 3 years to become a Master Mason. What I want is that once you become a Master Mason, you understand what the fraternity is, and that's what you wanted to be a part of, and you're willing to contribute and be a part of it. And I think we rush people through too quickly, and I think that's hurt us in the long run.
Along those same lines, what advice would you give to somebody who was going to be master of their lodge for the first time?
Well, we just had a meeting last week at Coloma talking about guys because we had one of our wardens drop out of line, and the discussion was, do we move everybody up or not? And my advice to them is, you don't want to be in that chair when you're still trying to learn ritual. You need to know the rituals so that year you're managing the lodge, you're organizing the calendar, you're putting on functions, you're doing whatever, and you don't have to spend all your time with your nose in a book. And if you skip a chair or two chairs, you're not going to be in that position. And I think it's more important to be educated and be there as a leader than it is to be in there and learning ritual and trying to keep things going that way.
I agree. What would you tell somebody that came to you and said, I'm going to run for Grand Lodge, or I'm thinking about running for Grand Lodge?
Well, I've had that happen recently too. It's my advice to them is that you need to talk to as many people as you can who have done that. We all have different experiences, and we all look at it a little differently, and a lot of it depends on where you live. I remember Bob Conley, who lived in Three Oaks or down in that area, traveling to Detroit for all these board meetings, or Lansing or Alma or whatever, telling everybody, when I'm Grand Master, our first board meeting is going to be at Exit 1. And if you live on this side of the state, you're going to do a lot of traveling. They need to understand that. It's a commitment not only of time and money, it's a family commitment. Your wife's either going to be with you a lot at these functions, or she's going to be by herself a lot while you're at those functions. You got to be there. And I think anybody that's looking at getting in the Grand Lodge line because they want that title are looking at it for the wrong reasons. It's a job we don't all leave legacies, but it's a job that requires a lot of work. And if you happen to be lucky enough to leave a legacy, that's great, but it's not necessary. John Polson said it's okay to keep things as they are. And I respected that, although I didn't keep things as they were necessarily, but I did respect that.
How would you say that Masonry's impacted your life?
Oh, in a lot of ways. I think my wife will tell you I'm a better person because I'm a Mason. I don't know what she's comparing that to, but I think she would tell you that. It's impacted my life because I know people that I never would have had the opportunity to get to know. I think I can honestly say that if I were in any state in this country, and a lot of foreign countries, and I needed advice or help or whatever, I would know someone to call. And I don't think there's a lot of people that can say that if they're not Masons or maybe have gone through the Grand Lodge line like we have. I look at some of the things that I get asked about. My daughter called me one day and said, "Dad, the Lakeshore High School band is going into D.C. to represent Michigan for the World War II dedication of the World War II memorial. And we've got a truckload of instruments that are very valuable, and there's no good place for us to park downtown that we think they're secure. And do you know anybody that might be able to help us?" I got on the phone to George Sagers at the memorial and told him our situation, and he said, "Bring the truck up here. We got security cameras all over the place, and they can leave it here the whole time they're there." And how would I have been able to do that, had I not been a Grand Lodge officer? The same band was going to Phoenix, Arizona to play in one of the big festivals out there. And they had a place to park the truck at the hotel they were staying, but the parking lot was going to be full, and they had no place to practice before the parade, at the Fiesta Bowl they were going out for. And Natalie called me and said, "Dad, what can you do?" And I called the El Zariba Shrine Club and said, "We got a big band coming out there and need a place to practice. Can we use your parking lot?" "Not a problem." So they went to the parking lot. You just, those are kinds of things you can't do unless you've had these experiences.
Yep, I agree. Any final reflections? Anything you want to add?
One of the things I forgot about when we were talking about what I did as Grand Master is I asked Jim Schultz to rewrite some ritual that would move the obligation that we take out of the obligation, or part of it, and make it the symbolic penalties. And that's just another thing that happened that year. We got to Grand Lodge, and the Board of General Purposes was very much against doing that. And I said, before we vote, and Bob McClellan, I think, was the vocal spokesperson, and he had been in the Board of General Purposes. And I said, before we vote, I would like for you to give me the opportunity to have Jim demonstrate how that will work in your lodge if you approve it. And the delegates let us do that demonstration. And once it was demonstrated, it was overwhelmingly approved. And we still live with it today, obviously. I still have trouble saying it that way because I learned it the old way, but I think it was the right thing to do. I was bothered by the terminology of the penalties. And I asked Harold Prong, I said, how can a man of the cloth kneel at the altar and take that obligation? And he said, we know it's symbolic. And I said, then that's what we need to make it. And that's what we did. So, it was a great year. Wouldn't change it for anything. It's hard to do when you're working as I was, and I think I've told you the story that I probably couldn't have if the president of Whirlpool had not been a member of my lodge. And he came into my office a month or so before I was going to be installed as Grand Master, and he said, "Don, are you going to be able to be Grand Master and work too?" And I said, "Bill, let me put it this way. I hope I can be Grand Master and draw a paycheck too." So he saw to it that I continued to draw my paycheck, and it was a great trip.
It was. Well, Don, we'd like to thank you for being with us today and participating in the Legacy series. And I also want to thank you personally, because I consider you one of my Masonic mentors.
Well, I appreciate that, Walt.
Yep.
And glad I could be here, and glad we can do the Legacy. I'm anxious to see what it looks like. Thank you.